And now we have a very unusual speaker, somebody who's studied archaeology, anthropology, art history, and then did a PhD on the culture of disgust. Christopher Turner has also written a book called The Adventures of the Orgasmatron, How the Sexual Revolution Came to America. And he tells us about the sexual lives and dreams of people like Norman Mailer, J.D. Salinger, Einstein, and a whole generation that are legendary names for us. To speak to him is the THiNK editor, Tarun Tejpal. Please welcome them on stage.
You can guess the sort of delicacy of the programming that the team at THiNK does, from sax to sex now. Christopher Turner, he wrote a book on a man who met Freud when he was 22, a man called Wilhelm Reich. And Wilhelm Reich actually coined the phrase, the sexual revolution, which we've all grown up with. What I want to ask Chris right away is how old was he when he met Wilhelm Reich and decided that he was going to devote many years of his life to retelling the story of Wilhelm Reich, whom most of us don't know very well, but the moment she starts talking about, you'll understand how many of the springs of modern culture and thought actually stem from a man called Wilhelm Reich, who at 22 went and met Sigmund Freud, and Freud thought he was an extremely bright man and conscripted him straight away. Chris Turner himself has studied all kinds of things, anthropology, sociology, archaeology, but after having studied all that, he decided that his vocation in life would be to study the orgasm, which I would say is actually a very, very fruitful preoccupation. Also, just a quick flag here, you can see how the women who run THiNK and THiNK do the programming. If it's Save the World, Save the Ganga, Save Afghanistan, it's the women. If it's the disillusions of sex, it's Tarun. Send him there. so Chris Turner for you.
Okay.
Chris, tell us straight away, when did you meet Wilhelm Reich?
Well, Wilhelm Reich died in '57, so I didn't actually meet him. But I first heard of Wilhelm Reich when I was 19, when I was a university student at Cambridge. And I read anthropology, and I didn't want to go and turn up for 3 months in some desert tribe somewhere and say, I'm going to study you for 3 months and then go back and write it up at Cambridge. So I chose to do backyard anthropology and apply anthropological techniques to my own culture. And I went to this school called Summerhill, a free school, this kind of radical experiment that started in the 1920s. It was founded by A.S. Neal, and it was in Suffolk, a couple of hours north of London, and handy for Cambridge. I could commute. I turned up there, and I was offered this teepee as a place to live, and I liked the idea of living in a teepee for a summer, the ironic anthropologist. But the kids vote on everything, and they voted to keep the teepee for their smoking, and I wasn't allowed to stay there. So I stayed in a bed and breakfast in Leiston. The town's other attraction is Sizewell B, a nuclear power station. So I stayed there with a whole load of nuclear power station workers for a summer. And they kept on being given gifts from the nuclear power stations, towels and crockery and stuff. So it was like this theme park to a nuclear power station. And I stayed there the summer. And I found out that A.S. Neal had been in therapy with Wilhelm Reich and had traveled to Oslo in the school holidays for many years to have this very eccentric therapy that Reich pioneered. He was a student of Freud's. He was one of the youngest of Freud's pupils. He was the kind of at the forefront of the second generation of psychoanalysis. And Freud, at one stage, considered him his heir apparent. He thought that Reich might take over the psychoanalytic movement from him. He told his daughter Anna Freud that he was one of the best heads in the Psychoanalytic Association. And until they fell out over Reich's kind of obsession with the orgasm, his future in the psychoanalytic movement looked very promising. But in 1927, Reich wrote this book with this very avant-garde title, The Function of the Orgasm. It's quite early to have a book with such a radical title. And he basically thought that all neurosis was caused by the lack of repeated sexual satisfaction. And,
by the lack of it.
Lack of it, yeah.
I hope.
So Freud got a bit upset by Reich's obsession with the orgasm. He called it Reich's personal hobby horse. But when I got there as a young man to Summerhill, I read this correspondence between A.S. Neal and Reich, which kind of started with Freud and went through on this great big journey, across the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. And it was an amazing document about the Cold War and about about totalitarianism and how people really thought in this utopian way that sex could somehow be used, it was a battleground, that sex could somehow combat totalitarian ideas.
And there was this whole strain of Marxism that he was very much into. So where did that all square off? The Marxism and the orgasm?
Yeah, well, Reich got interested in communism quite late, in the late 20s, and when there was some civil unrest in Austria and the police brutally suppressed political uprising. Some people had been shot by right-wing militia, and there was a big demonstration against this when they got let off with very light sentences, and the police suppressed it. And that turned Reich on to communism, and that put him at odds with the psychoanalytic movement. Freud wanted to protect psychoanalysis from politics. He didn't want, he didn't want it to become a kind of Bolshevik science. So, Reich's interest in communism put him at loggerheads with the psychoanalytic movement. And because he was a psychoanalyst, he was in loggerhead with the communists. So he fell between two stools, as it were, and he was eventually thrown out of the psychoanalytic movement and the Communist Party.
But in his own writings, how was he squaring this whole business of Marxism and the orgasm?
Okay. Well, he thought that the Bolshevik revolution had failed because they hadn't managed to overthrow sexual repression.
Oh.
So sexual repression had kind of come back to destroy the Bolshevik revolution, and a true revolution would be one in which there was sexual freedom. You could whereas Freud thought that some degree of repression was kind of intrinsic to the human condition, Reich thought that sexual repression could be overthrown to have what his critics dismissed as a genital utopia.
Freud clearly sort of thought that partial repression was then sublimated into other kind of more creative activities.
Yeah.
Where did Wilhelm differ from Freud in that?
Well, Reich thought that Freud's early ideas, he was building on Freud's early ideas. He thought that Freud had this early radicalism that he withdrew from. So he thought he was representing the true Freud in returning to these early ideas of neurosis being caused by sexual repression, and to be able to overthrow those, you would be able to have, kind of radical, alive society.
At some point, Reich moves to America, right? In 1939? What's the change that takes place from Reich working in Europe with the psychoanalysts of Europe, and then when he comes to America?
Well, Reich lived in Berlin when the fascists assumed power, and he left Berlin in 1933.
But is it just to sort of interrupt you, is it not true that the Nazis were using some of Reich's ideas at some point?
Well, there was one Nazi scientist that seems to have been very influenced by Reich, and Reich had these theories of, kind of breathe. Well, basically, everyone thinks that the Nazis were incredibly sexually repressed, and that's why they had all these kind of like extreme, horrible ideas. It's blamed on their sexual repression, which is kind of Reich's legacy. He wrote a book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which argued that. But in reality, as we know now, Nazis had these big sex clubs, in the Black Forest, and were kind of sexually liberated in their way. So some people were interested some Nazis were interested in Reich, but obviously he was a Jew, he was a psychoanalyst, he was a communist, everything they hated. So he actually fled around Europe, and he ended up in various Scandinavian countries, getting thrown out of all these countries. And he ended up in Oslo, where he effectively went mad. He was a persecuted man, and he had this kind of schizoid interlude. So when he came to America, he'd been thrown out of the psychoanalytic movement, he'd been thrown out of the Communist Party. He was a very beleaguered figure, and he managed to get a visa at the New School. His friend, the anthropologist Malinowski, managed to secure him this position at the New School. And he arrived in America full of hope that his ideas that had been rejected in Europe, all his kind of big battles in the sex reform movement, he had many followers in the early 30s in Europe. he kind of thought that when he arrived in America, he'd have this fresh chance. But effectively, he was totally mad by the time he arrived.
The sexual revolution, the phrase itself, at what point does he use it or does it get used around his work?
Well, interestingly, the sexual revolution that we think of in the 60s was called, in the 60s, the second sexual revolution. So the first sexual revolution was thought to take place in the 30s, in the Jazz Age, and that's when Reich coined the phrase.
And Reich's ideas were then being picked up and repeated all over, were they?
Well, in the 60s, definitely, the 68ers, they would daub Reichian slogans on the wall, read Reich and react accordingly. His message became very popular amongst the kind of 60s generation.
Before I go further, let me just go a little back. How does a British academic decide to investigate sex? I thought the Brits don't do it.
I know. Well, that's probably it's probably my own battle with my own sexual oppression that made me interested in this subject. Always attracted to very liberated figures.
Did your family disapprove of your studies?
Not particularly. My family don't read anything I write, so I have license to do whatever I want.
No, but you were beginning to tell me about how you actually got into reading about Reich, and then how long did it take you to actually do the research and work and was there enough material available?
Well, kind of what fascinated me about this as a historian was Reich, when he went crazy, soon after he arrived in America, he invented this thing called the orgone box, the orgone energy accumulator, which Woody Allen satirized as the orgasmatron in Sleeper.
No, just a moment. He needs to describe the orgone accumulator to all of you. I mean, this is the thing that gives you the hyperorgasm. So I request you to describe it in detail.
Okay.
So some of them can get those made at home.
Okay, you can make them yourselves. It's effectively a wooden box lined with sheet metal and stuffed with layers of rock and steel wool in alternate layers. The instructions are on the internet if you want to to try and make one. They were incredibly popular in the 40s and 50s. All these people who should have known better built them. William Burroughs claimed to have had a spontaneous orgasm in one of these boxes. J.D. Salinger had one. Kerouac, Norman Mailer, Sean Connery, at the height of his Dr. No fame, sat in one of these boxes. And I've sat in quite a few because everyone I go to interview who is a believer invites me to sit in their orgone energy accumulator.
So tell us about your experience in these.
Well, I was a bit intrepid at first because I was worried, I'd read about...
How large are these orgone accumulators?
They're about the size of a small telephone box. They're quite claustrophobic to sit inside. And after I'd heard of William Burroughs' spontaneous orgasm in the box, I was wondering that my book would suddenly become this, evangelical endorsement of this device. But I thought about half an hour in a box was polite. So
and nothing happened?
Nothing happened to me apart from it gets quite hot in there, but not sexual heat.
Is it true that Norman Mailer had one of them in his barn or his garage or something?
He did. He built quite a few. He was quite handy and made them in the shape of Easter eggs so that he could kind of roll around on the lawn in them. And when I met Norman Mailer to talk to him about the box, he did say that now he thought that the box was kind of crap. But then he compared it, interestingly, to the atomic shelters that people used to have in the 50s. They built these like basement bunkers and lined them with corned beef and stuff like that. And then 10 years later, they were a bit embarrassed that they had these things in their cellars. But
didn't Mailer say to you that he fundamentally believed that Wilhelm Reich,
he did,
in his driving philosophy, was basically right?
He said that Reich was one of the main influences on his own writing, not as a stylist. In his modestly titled Advertisements for Myself, Mailer described Reich as a thinker as hip and as a writer as square. But it was Reich as a thinker that he took from. And he told me some, he said that he was attracted to Reich because he had an itch in his own orgasm. And he took from Reich the belief that the better your orgasms were, the better you were as a person. And,
is that true?
Well, for Mailer it was true, but he was known as the kind of, for his belief in the apocalyptic orgasm, which all these hipsters in the 50s were aiming for.
What is the apocalyptic orgasm?
Well, it's an orgasm that can shatter all boundaries and conventions. It's the the great big orgasm that we're all searching for. But anyway, after we had this meeting, Mailer rang me up, and I had one of these telephones that announced the caller, so it was like Mailer Norman, Mailer Norman. I was scrabbling around for my voice recorder so I could record his profound thoughts. And I picked up the phone. He went, "Chris, I just want to add one thing. Intellectuals can't have good orgasms." I can't speak for professional footballers, but intellectuals can't have good orgasms. And I was telling this story to a friend of mine, my editor at the London Review of Books, and he responded rather defensively, "That's not true."
Well, is he Brit, the editor?
He's a Brit, yeah.
Saul Bellow. Saul Bellow also tried it out. What happened with him?
Saul Bellow used to go for Reichian therapy, which was this, when Reich split with the psychoanalytic movement, he at the time, any touching of the patient was considered seductive. Analysts wouldn't even shake the patient's hand at the end of a session. But when he split with psychoanalysis, Reich pioneered this thing that his wife described as substituting, talking for a physical attack on the patient. And it really was like that. He thought that congealed in your musculature were repressions, and that he as an analyst could see where these blocks were and dissolve them with this incredibly painful massage. So, patients would scream out, as he dug his thumbs into them to kind of release these blocks in the musculature. And Saul Bellow would go to Queen's and submit to this therapy. And he sat in the box as an adjunct to it. One of his friends introduced him to it, one of his friends from Chicago. And he was a sort of enthusiastic, believer in Reich at one stage. Then he became very conservative in his later life, and he described the sexual revolution as a 30-year mistake at the end of his life. But I submitted to this Reichian therapy as part of my research for the book. And I had 3 trial sessions, and my God, it was painful. I found myself screaming, and these analysts would boast of the bruises that they inflicted on their patients. And it was an amazing thing to imagine Reich's pupils not only submitting to him intellectually, but submitting to him physically like that. It was a very, very strange moment in the history of science.
Did Sigmund Freud disavow Reich completely by the time he died?
He did. When Reich was being forced out of various countries, Reich's pupils wrote to Freud asking for his help to write letters in support of Reich, and he refused. At that time, psychoanalysis was being, the Nazis were basically closing down the psychoanalytic movement. All the Jewish psychoanalysts were being ejected from the Viennese Psychoanalytic Society and the Berlin equivalent. And Freud, rather naively, thought that by not allowing psychoanalysis to become infected with politics, he would protect its status as a pure science. And Reich, as the leader of this second generation, objected to that. They thought that the psychoanalysts should fight back against fascism. Whereas, Freud at that stage was very old. He was riddled with cancer. And, he kind of stayed in Vienna way later than any other of the Jewish psychoanalysts. And eventually he came to London. He lived a year in London and died in London.
Once he comes to America and he begins to sort of try and drum this evangelical fervor for this bizarre combination of Marxism and of orgasm, what happens with him? Does he have a personal life at any point?
Well, when he came to America, he was heralded quite early on in 1947 as the guru of the new cult of sex and anarchy. He was translating his books from German and selling them through his own press. And he found this incredibly large audience among the bohemians and beatniks on the east and west coasts. He was selling huge numbers of books amongst these kind of like hippie communities that were springing up along the Pacific Palisades and in Greenwich Village. And he found himself at this forefront of this movement that he hadn't met. He didn't know these people. He was sort of stuck in his little therapeutic circle in New York. So he had this reach, that was quite elaborate. And as soon as Harper's Magazine, described him as this leader of this new cult of sex and anarchy, the authorities suddenly got suspicious of him. And the Food and Drug Administration, when they heard that he invented this box, which he not only claimed could cure sexual repression, but could cure cancer, he was heralded as a fraud, and the Food and Drug Administration started a 7-year investigation into him, which cost them $2 million. It's an extraordinary amount of money to spend on sort of clamping down some thinker, basically. And I think that was because they saw him as the figurehead of this new kind of like sexually liberated culture that they objected to. The Kinsey reports were coming out at the same time. In 1948, Kinsey published his first report. And it showed America as this more sexually enlightened place than people imagined. And Reich and Kinsey were both became kind of scapegoats of that.
Did Reich himself claim to have had the apocalyptic orgasm?
He did claim to. He didn't describe it as apocalyptic, but he was described by one of his followers as a genital narcissist. And he certainly believed that his orgasms were saving him. And if he went a few days without having an orgasm, he said that he got big black bags under his eyes and felt depressed and miserable.
Now that we are in 2012, would you say that what Reich set out to do, in a sense, liberate, has that come to pass in some ways?
Well, one of the things that interested me, I read this article in Time magazine in 1964, and it said that Wilhelm Reich perhaps is a prophet, because now, in 64, the whole of America had become one great big orgone box. Everywhere were these messages that sex could save you and libido set you free. All the popular music, the sort of the magazines on the newsstand that a few years earlier would have been considered pornographic, the films. There was this kind of belief that sexual repression was bad. And I think that is something that we have inherited from Reich. You can take that right through from Reich in the 1930s to Sex in the City. It's like a...
But that's an interesting inflection point, because isn't it true that part of his fascination with Marxism also inflected his kind of pursuit of the orgasm, because he often felt that sex would get completely commodified in a capitalist society?
Yeah. Well, sex did get completely commodified in a capitalist society.
So his fear was right.
Yeah, and the sexual revolution, as it happened, was a technological one, really. In the 57, the pill was first licensed. That was the year he died. I was interested in Reich as this kind of intellectual forefather of this movement. But certainly, another one of his, kind of intellectual colleagues, Herbert Marcuse, came up with this idea of surplus repression, that you could have a certain amount of sexual freedom, but, there was this kind of repression that could kind of be siphoned off and co-opted by the authorities, and used as a kind of more devious and discrete form of power. And I think that's what I set out to look at in my book. Why was the symbol of the sexual revolution a box that you climbed into? Why did you climb into a closet hoping for sexual liberation? And what would that, as a symbol of the sexual revolution, allow you to say about what eventually happened? How would it let you look at the ironies, read the sexual revolution against the grain? And I think certainly how sex became commodified was a sort of the end point of my book, looking at how advertising started to use messages of sexual freedom to sell stuff, how the sexual revolution basically got commodified incredibly quickly.
Before they ring the bell on us, from all your assiduous, from your assiduous sort of research on Reich, the orgasm and sex, any tips for this audience?
Well, I wish I could promise everyone apocalyptic orgasms. Maybe I should.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners, we shall overcome.
Und nichts anderes! Wow! Und nicht das Doppel!
मैंने कोई फौज नहीं बनाई, मैंने कोई बंदूक इस्तेमाल नहीं की, मेरा हथियार था सिर्फ कलम।